Okay, let's talk about sports. Primarily track and field, most specifically women's track and field. Before we get into this topic, it's probably useful to define what male and female mean and what we mean when we say those terms. The definition that I use is anyone possessing a Y chromosome in their DNA is male. All others are female. So that's what I'll go with. Now, these days, that's a controversial definition. I know it'll surprise some of you because, a number of years ago, that would have been unremarkable to say that or suggest that and not widely disputed. But any of you who follow track and field as closely as many follow football, let's say, or something, will be aware of Caster Semenya. Caster Semenya, as well as Wambui and Niyonsaba, who all seem to run the same event, the 800 meters, 2 laps. Caster Semenya has been unbeatable running in the women's division in this event in recent years. The Track and Field Federation has recently changed the rule such that only people possessing testosterone levels well below that of the male range, which would put you still above the female range, are going to be allowed to compete in the female division. Now, this is controversial because as of right now, as of 1 year ago today, let's say, as of right now, things have changed on the international stage, but perhaps not at the high school stage. We still have boys competing in the girls division, much to the chagrin of the girls that would have been winning and their parents. But on the international stage, and up until very recently, men were allowed to compete in the women's division, right? Meaning persons with a Y chromosome, or such as the runners I mentioned, were allowed to compete in the women's division. Now, many people wanted this to change. So what's the upshot of all this from a social viewpoint or a justice viewpoint or something? Well, there's a couple camps that you might think would normally be on the same sides that at this are completely opposed, diametrically opposed. They want exactly opposite outcomes. One says, and this camp has existed since, probably the 18th century or a couple centuries earlier, certainly the past 100 years. This has been a well-known school of thought, a well-known camp that has successfully gotten women's sports to exist, because there might have been a time in many sports in which there was only one division. The people winning it were the best men. So that school of thought would be those that feel there should be categories based on Y chromosome or lack thereof, male and female, in sports, such that women have a chance to win events against other women. I clearly would not oppose this. Needless to say, I'm not some bizarre throwback to the 10th century or some futurist like some people today that feel there should be just one division in which only men are going to be able to compete, because as it is in track and field, the qualifying standards to get into big important international meets are well above or below in times, but more difficult than, I'll say above in a jump or a throw and below in a race, if that makes any sense. But let's just say more difficult than, stricter than the women's world records, meaning, no one female has ever run, 800 meters would be an event to mention because that's the most controversial one lately with these three, maybe I should not, gender non-specific, perhaps I could say, because it's going to be offend some to say men for Semenya primarily, winning every race entered, and Wambui and Niyonsaba as well. So I'll just say, individuals with a Y chromosome, some people have always felt that shouldn't be allowed in a female race, that there should be women's only competitions. And there has been in the Olympics for many, many Olympic cycles. And, we now see women's soccer and women's basketball. And this isn't brand new. This kind of thing's been happening for a long time. NCAA has men's and women's events in which they're completely separate. Women don't have to compete against the men, which go back to what I was saying a minute ago, is very significant because no one female has ever been even good enough to get into the big meets in track and field. And I suspect they'll be same with any number of sports. In something like basketball or hockey, the best female competitors might stand out head and shoulders above other women, but would not even be able to make a college team on the men's side. That's probably true in a lot of sports. Track and field is the one I'm most familiar with, and I can assure you that Olympic qualifying standards, for example, are faster than the women's world records will ever be. Women's world records being, not even quite good men's collegiate times, women's world records being, and these are outliers, women's world records, something has been done once, would be good boys high school times, pretty good boys high school times. But if that puts it into perspective, good boys high school times aren't even close to winning, gold medals or setting records in open men's events, or even qualifying for competitions in open men's events. So the very significant gulf, specifically in running events, is 11%. That might not sound a lot, but if you look at any world record chart, go to the IAAF or USATF websites, and you'll be able to see these. Track and Field News, is a publication I'll give a plug to. They list world records, and you'll see that almost all the world records, men's to women's, are exactly 11% apart, or within a couple, tenths of a percent of that. Which might not seem big, but it's very big. It's the difference between winning gold medals and being not even close to good enough to be in the race, right? So I have respect for women's sports and hope they live on, hope they continue. So that's one school of thought that agrees with me on that. There's another that said individuals should be allowed to choose their gender. Okay, like no one should be prohibited by the assignment of some, white male doctor at birth, or some closed-minded parents who, started calling you a girl or boy or whatever arbitrarily. Those high school boys that are competing in the girls' division and very easily winning, though they wouldn't have in the boys' division, right? The 25th best, boy sprinter in any given state meet can still very easily win the girls' race. I mean, just look up, your states or some, big populous state meet and look at the winning times. That's all it takes to prove that. Which I'm not trying to be derogatory to women. Quite the opposite. I don't feel they should have to compete against men, but the camp that says gender fluidity should rule sports is completely at odds with those that believe there should be women's sports. Because if the rule hadn't changed as of this year only, very recently, and that the men who can never quite make it into the Olympics or the World Championships, the men that aren't quite good enough to compete on the biggest stage, those that enter major marathons but get 20th place, but ahead of the first female competitor, like a semi-pro runner might. All they have to do as of a year ago, let's say, or even a matter of months ago, is just enter the women's division and win it very easily. Whereas they wouldn't have been competitive at all in that same race in the men's division. So that was the case until recently, Semenya being the most famous example of that. And so that's now changed. So I'm wondering what you all think, if you're consider yourself very open-minded and very woke, or whatever term you want to use, you're a social justice warrior. Well, where do you stand on this? You can't believe, you can't say there should A, be women's sports, and B, people should be allowed to choose whether to compete in the men's or women's division, because if men are allowed to compete in the women's division, there will be cease to be a women's division. I mean, C-list Kenyans, those that aren't quite big time enough to get shoe contracts and get paid their trip paid to these big famous races. There's several hundred of them that are still better than any female Kenyan has ever been. Right? And so the second you just open the door to choose your gender, there won't be women's sports anymore. This has been commented on by many greater minds than mine. A simple Google search will see various track professionals, track commentators, physiologists and doctors commenting on exactly this topic. And so I'm just weighing in because you see both sides now in the track world. Almost all say what I say. The physiologists that weigh in do point out that there's an 11% difference, over those with Y chromosomes than without, and that's primarily the science community thinks. Again, I'm not the one coming up with this. It's people far smarter than me who've actually studied it. I think that's because of the testosterone level. So as of now, if you consider yourself transgender, or just consider yourself improperly assigned male at birth, and you wish to compete in the women's division, you have to test for testosterone. And this was once the case, but it hasn't been for the past couple of years. This was the case a while ago, and it is again now. We think, some of this is up in the air still before the bulk of the outdoor track season starts, that you'll have to test, and you can't go above a certain amount, and that amount is still, multiple times what the highest women have ever tested at, but below what the male competitors in the male division would have, or even perhaps, a middle-aged male. So that's the state. They're going back to two distinct divisions. Is that unjust? Because you're no longer allowed to just choose, what gender you want to be, and there's none of this fluidity allowed? Or is it in fact just because, women don't have to compete against men, who aren't good enough to win men's medals? Because all male competitors who are good enough to win world championship and Olympic medals in the men's division are staying in the men's division. No one close to a men's world record's ever come down to run in the women's division. Right, and I shouldn't even say come down. That's even perhaps derogatory, which I'm not attempting to be in the least. To the contrary, trying to defend, an entire half the population and their right to compete only against each other. So where do you weigh in on this? Do you believe in women's rights? Do you believe in gender fluidity? Because those are exactly opposite stances on this. If it goes back to how it was the past 3 years, then we will just simply no longer have women's sports. It'll be one division in which the best men will be competing and winning. So, we can have that. I mean, that is in fact superior to what we've had the past few years, in which a male competitor who is as good as some random middle-aged guy trying to make it but will never be pro, someone of that level could actually go be competitive in the women's division. That's how it's been recently, and now it's going back to what you might say is more traditional. So is more traditional bad because it means that these white males are imposing arbitrary standards on people and demanding what they do and not do? Or is it good because there can be women's sports? You can't have it both ways. So pick your side, if you will. Look into it more and read what experts have written. And in the meantime, thanks for listening. This is The Way of Life.